Welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, and welcome to this week's edition of our morning briefings on geopolitical challenges. We are live here on Zoom every Thursday at 8:30 a.m. and on YouTube afterwards. My name is Jan Stöckmann, and I'm head of the Joint Director's Office here at DGAP, and it is my great pleasure to be chairing today's briefing, which is our last briefing in 2023. And we will restart in January, on the 11th of January, 2024, next year. Today, this morning, we will be talking about the EU summit that starts in Brussels today, gathering heads of government for what has been described as a crucial meeting for Europe's support to Ukraine, but also for the EU itself. Since the Commission's recommendation in November to open accession negotiations with Ukraine and Moldova, there has been a lot of debate. In particular, as you all know, Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has signaled his strong opposition while also blocking financial support for Ukraine. And his bargaining is showing results. Only last night, we heard that the Commission released 10 billion euros of cohesion policy funding, which was previously frozen for Hungary, saying that it was now satisfied with Hungary's measures to ensure judicial independence, a decision that was heavily criticized by MEPs across the party spectrum. I should mention here that my colleagues Milan Nitsch and Frauke Sebas just published a paper on this in our house magazine IPQ. But it seems that the bargaining continues. An Orban advisor said that Budapest will be ready to give in on Ukraine funds should the EU unblock the remaining 20 billion earmarked for Hungary. And so, in other words, there is a lot of pressure on the EU to act, not only with regard to Ukraine, but also in terms of its budget and its own institutional setup for the various crises facing Europe. To discuss the looming deadlock over these issues, we are delighted to have an excellent panel this morning. First up will be Professor Daniela Schwarzer, who is a member of the executive board at Bertelsmann Stiftung and previously director of DGAP and still a board member of DGAP. In previous positions, served as executive director Europe at OSF, as well as at the GMF and other places. And I should also mention that Daniela is the co-author of a Franco-German report that was published in September called Sailing on High Seas on Reforming and Enlarging the EU. Welcome, Daniela.
Good morning.
Next will be Dr. Peter Kreko, who is the director of Political Capital Institute based in Budapest and a senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. An economist and political psychologist by training, Peter focuses on European politics, disinformation, and hopefully can help us to understand things from a Hungarian point of view. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks for having me. Good morning.
Last but certainly not least will be Silke Vetter, who is the Brussels correspondent of Wirtschaftswoche, the German weekly business news magazine. An economist by training, she has reported from Brussels for over 20 years and will hopefully be able to give us the latest talk of town from Brussels. Welcome, Silke.
Good morning.
Before we begin, just a few housekeeping announcements. We would like to remind you that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded subsequently. We will kick off our conversation on the panel and then open up for questions after about 30 minutes or so. I should let you know that Daniela Schwarzer has to leave at 9 a.m. So if you want to ask her questions, be quick. If you would like to ask questions during the Q&A, please use the raise your hand button. And finally, let me say a word of thanks to my colleagues in the events and communications teams, and above all to you, our listeners in the audience, for joining and for asking crisp and intelligent questions. Now, without much further ado, Daniela, can I ask you to kick us off with an overview of the key decisions that are at stake at the summit and why they matter?
Yes, thank you very much, Jan, for having me. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning, albeit only for 30 minutes. Yes, this is a crucial summit. And I think, to frame it in the I would say, broadest way, this summit is about the commitment of member states to work on the geographical scope and the architecture of the EU in a serious way. Now, over the past almost 12 months, work has been going on behind the scenes which regards the EU's readiness to actually absorb new member states. And in parallel, of course, the question of assessing candidate countries, moving on with negotiations has also advanced. And what I think the attention is at the moment most focused on is surely the question whether Ukraine and the Republic of Moldova are advancing in their accession process. And Jan, you have already mentioned Hungary as the country that over the past weeks has built up a veto position, which it may leave for a deal on EU funds, or which it may not leave. We will see. There was more pessimism ahead of the summit among leaders across the EU to actually be able to strike a deal with Hungary to say, okay, we'll release part of your money, which has been withheld for reasons of non-compliance with rule of law standards, for the deal that the EU can actually open negotiations. And the focus was in particular on Ukraine. So Viktor Orban played things more toughly than ahead of other decisions, for instance, on sanctions regarding Russia. But it also shows that, in terms of geopolitical agreement across the EU member states, that enlargement has to happen and has to advance, there's clearly one member state that does not agree. Why is that a problem for the EU? First of all, obviously, because there is an importance in showing Ukraine and the Republic of Moldova, which are the countries that most recently got candidate status, that the EU is actually serious. The second point is that the signal, whatever happens with Ukraine and the Republic of Moldova, will also be read in a very careful way by the Western Balkan countries. Who some of them have been stuck in negotiations since the year 2012, so for basically 2 decades. Now, yesterday, EU leaders held a summit with the Western Balkans, and the message there was very clear, asking them to move ahead with reforms and telling them again that they have a perspective in the European Union. But if these are just words and there's no action following during the summit that is being held as of today, this, re-dynamization of the enlargement process will not have full credibility. So what are the signals to look out for during the summit that starts today? First of all, clearly the opening of negotiations with Ukraine, whether the EU is able to agree with all 27 states that this is possible. The second element, which I find crucially important, is whether in the Council conclusions, there will also be a commitment on the EU side to get enlargement ready itself. Right now, there are positions among some member states that say we need a reform of the European Union in terms of decision-making and institutional setup. Part of those reforms are possible without treaty change, but some of them may need a treaty change, which could be done when the first new country joins the EU as part of the accession treaties, which is a way to change EU primary law. But the fundamental question is whether this European Council meeting will conclude that the EU has to do its own homework. Institutions matter, decision-making procedures matter. Germany is among those member states that has been defending an extension of qualified majority voting, for instance, to other fields. Some member states completely disagree with that idea, so there are issues in the background that are already being worked on with regards to institutions and decision-making. But there are others that are also crucially important. I wish to mention one topic which, as a result of the report, which I co-authored, together with in total 12 experts from France and Germany, it became very clear how central the issue of protecting the rule of law within the European Union has become. Of course, we all know the case of Hungary and the case of Poland that were in breach or are in breach of that principle. But there is a big concern among some governments that a too rapid enlargement may lead to a situation where it's even harder to protect that principle. So the whole idea of reforming Article 7 as part of a primary law revision has gained interest. But of course, it's hard to reform a treaty provision that is supposed to protect the rule of law if you have some countries in the EU that are in violation of that principle and that will not give their consent. So again, we have veto players around. And yet, if countries are brought in that may not respect rule of law fully, it will be even harder to protect that principle. This brings me to my last point, and that is the other debate that is going on with Hungary over the EU funds and whether they should be given to Hungary at this moment to buy support for the opening of accession talks with Ukraine. Jan, you mentioned the heavy criticism that was present in Brussels and in national capitals around the question whether money should be released to Hungary under these circumstances. This is an extremely difficult decision, and I think it shows that there is still an enormous weakness in the conditionality principle that was introduced with the Next Generation EU Fund to the spending of this 750 billion budget vehicle. I do believe that still the principle of making rule of law a condition for EU spending in member states is actually the only feasible way to enforce that principle over the next few years. I've spoken about the possibility to revise EU treaties, but the question of unanimity will very likely make that very difficult. So I think, and this is the last point that is being discussed at the summit as well, which has huge importance for the EU going forward, the question of the EU budget and the ability of EU member states to agree. We are at a crucial point where the EU, if it is serious about enlargement, needs to review its own architecture, as I've said. It needs to enforce the rule of law principle to also enhance its own credibility vis-a-vis member states. And finally, it needs to prepare the grounds, and here the Council conclusions can at maximum point the direction that in order to get the EU enlargement ready, also the EU budget and the EU policies need to be reviewed. That is very clear. So we are at a crucial point where we will not see any detailed solutions at this EU summit. This is not what it's for. But it is extremely important to see whether in the conclusions we see a commitment to starting negotiations with, in particular, Ukraine, but then also whether the right directions are pointed out for what the EU needs to do to get enlargement ready, ideally, as I would say, by the year 2030, which doesn't mean accession will happen then, but the EU needs to commit to its own reform and preparation. If it doesn't, it will not be able to have this positive and very important transformative power for the accession countries that are all in waiting to see whether the EU is serious. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniela. And it will be interesting to see whether the EU is capable of acting under the pressure mounting. So let's move on to Peter and hear from you about Orbán's tactics and how they are challenging the EU. If you could make some sense of that for us.
Yes. So first of all, thanks a lot for having me here. And also thanks for Daniela as well for the very insightful kickoff remarks. And beside Milan's piece that has been put here in the chat, I would also highly recommend Daniel Hegedűs's piece at the Visegrad Insight on Orbán's tactics, and I fully agree with what he elaborated there. So I will just make 5 quick points as a bit of explanation of what we can expect by Orbán on this summit, and also what is the bigger game he's playing. So my first point would be what we can expect. I think Orbán will be ready for a half compromise, in the sense that what I would expect, but I'm not 100% certain about that, is that Orbán will let go the midterm revision and they will say yes to the financial support to Ukraine. But on the other hand, I see lower possibility that he will say yes to starting the EU negotiations with Ukraine. The government itself and foreign ministry leaders in the background are sending signals that they are ready for any kind of compromise. But on the other hand, Orbán is so vocal about his disagreement with opening up the talks with Ukraine. And also he the whole governmental apparatus and also the governmental media is pushing this message so much that I think it would be quite difficult to backtrack from that. And also, I think after Austria has indicated as well that it might be rather ready to open up negotiations if it is bound to the integration of the Western Balkans countries, I think Orban has even more justification for his policy. Second point would be that it is about the bigger game, a bigger game from Orban. So first of all, Orban would like Ukraine to lose the war, and he's increasingly open about that. So you don't have to read between the lines that much. He's crystal clear, and not just in light of his meetings with Vladimir Putin and the high-level connections that the Hungarian government still maintains and even strengthens with Russia, but also Orban's main point is that without Russia there is no new security architecture of Europe, and Russia has to be involved, and for that Russia cannot be and even shouldn't be defeated. So he wants the defeat of Ukraine, and also he sees a big opportunity now because of the also in the United States there seems to be on the Republican side high unwillingness to keep up the support for Ukraine, but it's also about the ego of Orban. So part of the game is that he had many discussions so far with Olaf Scholz, with Emmanuel Macron. Even this morning he meets with Michel, Macron, Scholz. All the European media is about him. So his vision of becoming a really transformative leader on the European Union, he feels comes closer. My third point would be that Orban is not really open to bilateral deals with Ukraine. So we could just see that Orban have asked for two measures from Ukraine's side so that Hungary can support the integration of Ukraine. One was the removal of OTP Bank from the blacklist of Ukraine of companies that are supporting the war. It was fulfilled by Ukraine. The other one was to ease the restrictions of language use in education and other fields for ethnic Hungarians and ethnic minorities in Ukraine. The Rada have passed legislation on that. Still, it seems making no impact on Orban's policies. Also, Transcarpathian Hungarians in an unexpected unity asked Orban to give green light to the integration negotiations, and Orban seems to be unwilling to move forward even despite of that. So all the requests in bilateral level are just pretext. And the fourth point would be, and it will be my final one, is that the EU have to. I think the EU have to look at this vote right now in the European Council as a kind of experimentum crucis, as a final moment of truth. I would rather expect that despite Orban is receiving almost anything he wanted so far, and Daniela was right at mentioning, I mean, the release of funds by the Commission and so on, if he will not let go the most important decision, which I think at this moment would be more the EU integration, starting the negotiations with Ukraine, then I think EU leaders have to learn the lesson. And I think the lesson is increasingly that Orban is not the transactional leader. He is still regarded to be in many European capitals. I think he's more running a kind of Putinist foreign policy when you try to block everything, when you try to keep your fingers everywhere so that you can control the processes, but without being entirely clear about what he wants to achieve. And also for Orban, this whole game is also about slowing down EU decision-making and showing it that EU is incompetent in making the decisions And if this is the lesson, then I think the conclusion is that unfortunately, on the middle and long run, there seems to be no other solution than the Article 7 procedure. Mm-hmm. I will stop here.
Thank you, Peter. That's very interesting, but also worrisome insight on the dynamics that Orban is kicking off. Observers are predicting that it will be one of those classic Brussels summits where decisions of vital importance are taken in the early morning hours on very little sleep. And as a long-time observer of these summits, Silke, perhaps you could give us a sense of what your expectations are and perhaps predictions, if you will. Over to you.
Yes, good morning from Brussels. Thank you for having me. Well, we're in for a very long summit, and one of the indications is that interpreters have been asked to be ready, to be available during the weekend. So the summit might not stop on Friday as planned, but it could go into the early hours of Saturday or even longer. I think leaders are prepared to battle this out. This is not surprising because it's a summit with geopolitical stakes, and I think that would be my first point, and I only have 3. I'll be quick. I think this really sets this summit apart from previous summits. Well, we've seen a lot of bickering, we've seen serious fighting, but in the last few years, it was mostly about internal problems. I mean, the pandemic was very much an internal problem. Brexit had an international dimension, of course, but I think this time the stakes are extremely high because this is about shaping Europe. This is also about the European Union being serious about its values, because if you're talking about freedom, democracy, self-determination, and you don't deliver, you just don't come across as being very credible. So the credibility of the EU is at stake. If the EU is being seen as dithering, lacking determination, it doesn't come across as a geopolitical actor. And I find very interesting what Peter just said. I mean, Orban's goal is precisely to show that the EU is not effective and inefficient. So my second point would be the tactic of trying to kick the can down the road, which is a tactic that's very common in the EU. I would say this is basically the default way of operating. It's coming to its limit if you're actually acting in a geopolitical environment, precisely because it does harm your reputation. It really affects the way how you're being seen internationally. Daniela already mentioned the report she has co-authored. I'm also watching out what the Council conclusions will contain on reform. The last draft I have seen had a mention of a roadmap that's going to be presented at some point next year. A roadmap means we're buying some more time again. Daniela mentioned institutions and procedures. Of course, there is no reform of anything if you don't look at institutions and procedures. I would argue that one of the main things that should be looked at could be forgotten. I think the EU should really focus on what it should be doing. I was writing an article this week about breakfast directives, and you kind of think this is, I don't mean to do any EU bashing, but you're really playing into the hands of populists. You're playing into the hands of Orban, basically. If you have 7 directives on breakfast, and I had a closer look at what's being written there, and I could see civil servants in front of me working on this and claiming that the EU is looking after your health and you shouldn't be eating as much sugar. And unfortunately, I think we're really going to see more of that with a bigger commission. The more commissioners we get, the more politicians are tempted to venture into fields like health, which are not basically in the remit of the EU anyway. But we really have sort of a field that should be looked at closely. How do we get to a point where the EU does what it should be doing, where there is really added value. I'm a trained economist, so I would really look for externalities, positive externalities, added value. And obviously they're in the field of geopolitics, where the EU doesn't have a very strong track record, because it didn't set out to be a geopolitical player. And my last point would be, it's all very well to discuss corruption in Ukraine, but Europe shouldn't forget to do its homework. And when we look back a year ago, we had Qatargate. And a year on, we don't really know what's happening and what happened. And I mean, we had scenes like in a film. Belgian authorities found stashes of cash at the apartment of the vice president of the European Parliament. Now, if this happened in Ukraine, the outcry would be huge. I'm kind of wondering why so few people are talking about Qatargate 1 year on. You know, I mean, even the Parliament's procedures failed. It's not just Belgian authorities that haven't done a terribly good job. The European Parliament has never lifted the immunity of the former vice president. And you kind of think, what are these procedures? I mean, just again, imagine this happened in Ukraine, the Parliament not lifting immunity. We'd all cry foul. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, a lot of homework to be done as well. And I think I'll leave it at that. I tried to be brief so that we have some time for hopefully lively discussion.
Thank you so much. Let me get a 30-second question in for Daniela before she has to leave us. Daniela, you said that enlargement has become a geopolitical stake, a geopolitical necessity. If we look at public opinion polls, the European Council on Foreign Relations recently published a study that shows that there is general support for Ukraine to be joining EU, but not overwhelming, including Germany. So what is left to do on that front to convince people to go in this direction?
Well, first of all, you know, the mere fact that we consider enlargement of the EU, or many consider enlargement of the EU, a geopolitical necessity, means we are under pressure. And so we need to find a way forward where accession actually makes the EU stronger and not weaker. And that is why we need a broader narrative and explanation how the EU needs to change when it absorbs new members and what it is then supposed to do, and why this all serves the citizens' interests. So I think opinion poll data at the moment shows that, you know, there's some support for enlargement, but not overwhelming support, which actually, in my view, is no surprise, because first of all, we haven't had a thorough enlargement debate over the past few years. This is a topic that has come newly onto the agenda of public perceptions because of the war, so in a sort of threat connotation. And I do believe that public opinion will only, you know, be supportive of reform of the EU and enlargement of the EU in a broader sense than we currently see, if there is a possibility, and this is what policymakers really need to do now, to develop a strong and positive narrative why the EU in a reformed way and in an enlarged way continues to serve our interests. I don't think it's very, very hard to build this narrative, because we have a situation of a lot of external threats, which really make it more important that we work more closely together. And on the other hand, we still have really important strength in the European Union. The mere fact that so many countries are on their way to join or are hopeful to join shows us the model is still attractive. We are still, in comparison to other large economic areas, we are still in a position where we have considerable strength. But we, of course, do need to catch up and take a lead again, for instance, in the area of technology, innovation, digitization. So we have a huge agenda in front of us. But the truth of the matter is that we are better off if we do it together than if we do it individually. And that also applies to Germany, which is, after all, the fourth largest economy in the world. If we had to tackle all of this alone, we would be in a worse place than we are now as part of the EU. And I think this broader narrative needs to be put forward. It needs to include the enlargement, perspective and theme, and explain why a completely destabilized Western Balkan region, for instance, if we look at worst case scenarios with no perspective of integrating into the EU, would be very bad for us, not only for the countries at stake, and that there are strong forces in all countries that are currently negotiating their accession or are hopeful to be starting to negotiate. There are strong forces that actually want to push the reforms in their own countries forward and that are doing a lot. So this more differentiated picture is needed, and this clear acknowledgement of what the EU still serves our interests today. I think that is part of the overall effort that needs to be made to explain why enlargement is in our interest.
Thank you so much, Daniela. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, and bye. And sorry I have to leave early. Bye-bye.
Thanks. I know that we have another colleague of ours at the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, our senior research fellow, Shahin Baleh, who is in the audience and who is also a co-author of said report, I should mention, and who I'm sure will be able to comment as we go forward. But let's pick up some of the questions that are piling up in the chat. We have a question on Orban's desired outcome and potential new regional order that he's envisioning, which I think is directed to you, Peter, if you would like to take up this question.
Yes, thanks for the great question, and I try to give a brief response in the chat. So I do think that Orban is rather interested in a new regional chaos than in a new regional order. And if we take a look at what players he tries to reach out in the Western Balkans as well, they are more the troublemakers like Dodik than the ones who are bringing the real solution. What seems to be obvious is that Orban does not want, and I would not say it's in line with Hungarian interest. It's in line with his political interest. He does not want Ukraine to win. He does not want the European and Western interest to dominate in Ukraine. He would be rather more interested in a pro-Russian leader, I think, in Ukraine. And he picked up a personal fight with Volodymyr Zelensky. It was, I think, he even refers to Zelensky in a highly derogative manner in the come up of the council, and even he referred to their bilateral chat in Argentina in a way that it's also highly derogatory towards Zelensky. So I do think he would like Zelensky to fail. And he sees the big moment right now. And I do think, to a certain extent, this is a big moment in the sense that if Ukraine does not receive some kind of positive signals from the European Union, not only in terms of the financial support, which is, of course, crucial and important, but also in terms of political support, then I think it can undermine the morale in Ukraine high time. And again, when we see that in United States, the decision over financial support of Ukraine is also hanging, and Republicans are increasingly unwilling. I think for a good reason he sees that this is a moment where Zelensky and Ukraine's future are more in danger than before.
Thank you. I see a couple of more questions in the chat. One is by Peter Gottwald on leverage against Orban. Then there's a longish question from Georg Baumgarten, which I'm sorry, I cannot follow the chat while moderating. Perhaps, Georg, you could put the question in person. And then there's a question by Andreas Ratsch about the likely timeline of a restarted Article 7 procedure. So perhaps, Georg Baumgarten, if I could ask you to pose your question in person, and then we can collect these and send them to Silke and Peter in turn. Mr. Baumgarten? No, okay. Doesn't seem to be able to ask the question in person. Let's start with the other two questions first. Then the Article 7 and the leverage questions. Would you like to go first, please?
Yeah, I'd like to say something about Article 7 because Peter, you mentioned it as well, and I was reading it in this morning's handles. But I think it makes sense to evoke it because I mean it's there and it's there to be used. I don't see it being used before the elections, though, because it could enable Orban to present himself as a victim, and I think it could be really used very much by populists in the upcoming elections in early June next year. So my gut feeling, this is really gut feeling, and as Jan said, I've been here for more than 20 years. My gut feeling would be that leaders would try to avoid this because it could backfire hugely.
Peter, would you like to take this up as well?
I'm not that much aware of the procedural elements that András raised, so I would be happy. I mean, if someone else could tell more about that, I think it would be important. Yes, the reason why I told that I do not really see other kind of possibility on the midterm, on the longer term, that because it seems that Orban is just has an increasing appetite for obstruction, an increasing appetite for destruction of the European Union, and there is also a question in the chat about what other leverage EU has on Orban. I would be again happy if some has some more insightful comments on that. The problem right now is that Orban feels he has nothing to lose because he's mostly deprived of the EU money, and apart from his voting rights, he did not feel that he has anything to lose before this summit. And when you are in that mindset, then you can just go full combat. And right now, if he receives the EU funds or a big chunk of the EU funds, he is regarded to be the most important stakeholder almost in this whole question. I think he receives almost everything he wanted in advance. And I think it would be rather a disastrous read of that by EU leaders that, okay, finally we can make a deal. I would expect that there will be no conclusive vote on starting the EU negotiations, as I told before. And if this is the case, then I think I see simply no other option than Article 7. But again, I would be happy if others could come in if they have some other ideas on additional leverage.
I wouldn't be as pessimistic as you are from what I've heard from diplomats in the past few weeks, because it's really being seen as a disastrous outcome that people would want to avoid. I mean, obviously you're closer, and maybe EU diplomats don't have as many insights into Orban's thinking and his readiness to as how far he would really go. And I mean, there's still 20 billion that are being withheld by the EU Commission, but we've seen the release of the first tranche of 10 billion has caused backlash within the EU system. I mean, the European Parliament is extremely unhappy. I think the situation is really, really difficult politically because of what I mentioned, the elections coming up, and anything that's being used against Orban, I'm sure he will again try to exploit it, and there'll be other people using it. And I mean, again, he's very smart. He's saying that Ukraine is not ready to join. I think it's very smart. He's actually using an argument that a lot of people could agree with. So he's building his argument in a smart way that makes him so dangerous.
Yeah, so just one sentence response on that. Yeah, I think this is obviously a an argument that appearing in all over the European Union. But of course, if you just start the negotiations are exactly about making a member state ready for joining. So I mean, at the beginning of the negotiations, no one is ready for that. So I find it as a rather weak argument. But what is remarkable is that if you listen to the Republicans' counter argument this week in the Congress about why not to support Ukraine, I mean, you can really hear Orbanian sound bites there. So I think the arguments of Orban sell well in Europe and in the transatlantic domain as well.
Thank you, Peter. I think there are also questions to be asked about Hungarian domestic politics and why these tactics are working at home. I think that's some of what Georg Baumgarten is asking in the chat. Why these tactics aren't being opposed more. Before we come to this domestic politics question, I also want to bring in my colleague Milan Nitsch, who's having a conversation in the chat on Article 7 procedure and probably has more to add to the discussion as the co-author of the mentioned piece in the beginning. Over to you, Milan.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Jan. On Article 7, I think it's a very short answer. It doesn't work. And this is what Hungarian government learned, also the previous Polish government. It takes a long time. The discussions at the GAC level, General Affairs Council, on Article 7 led nowhere. And it didn't, I think, have a desired effect in the Polish case on the judiciary. What I think is more important here is in the general discussion about what to do with Orban's Hungary long-term in the EU that is becoming an increasingly politically divergent. So looking beyond the European Parliament elections, beyond formation of the new EU institutions, which will be done with the Hungarian presidency in the second half of next year, I think we should realize that the unique position of Hungarian Prime Minister, he knows he will outlast all EU leaders, given his power at home. And by the way, Peter, I would invite you to tell us what's happening in Hungarian Parliament this week, what kind of law they passed on complete surveillance of opposition and civil society in terms of money flows from outside. So you have a regime, you have a system or a ruling party that has taken over all the assets in the economy of the country that are financing their system and their party, and they are forming an institution that will surveil legally all the money inflows into politics and public discourse to the country from outside, making it illegal. Unfortunately, all this is possible within the Lisbon Treaty. So unless you push into not very vaguely defined sort of foundation principles of the EU in the Article 2. But here's the I think key point and the question. This is still a transactional Orban because he is preparing a compromise on the midterm revision of the budget, which is more important debate for all member states. This is part of why the 10 billion of frozen funds for Hungary were released, and it was clear already a few weeks ago that they were going to be released. And this is also why he clearly communicates that on the start of accession talks of Ukraine, he will block it. And he can block it in the same manner as Bulgaria blocked Northern Macedonia before, or France in 2019 blocked the accession talks opening with Albania and North Macedonia, even without having a credible argument. So on the accession process, this is the right of every member state to do it. And by the way, I think this is my hunch on his strategy. I think he's pushing the decisions to behind the European Parliament elections. This is what the Hungarian State Secretary for Europe also said, because he wants to decide about it during his own presidency and maybe tie it with the Western Balkans, push what Austria is now doing on Bosnia-Herzegovina. His key client, their ally Serbia, maybe he wants to, leverage it there. And instead of big summits in December 2023, he wants to have a big enlargement summit in 2024. But
Can I just add a request to Peter? I think it's also important to talk about the lack of freedom of the press in your country, because I think it's not well known outside of Hungary the extent of that, which has a huge impact on democracy.
Thank you, Milan, and thank you, Silke, for these questions. I think, Peter, you have plenty on your plate for now. Would you like to answer these questions first? And then after that, I will take in Shaheen with a comment.
Yes, thank you. And thanks, Milan, also for the great comments. Regarding the, I will start with Silke's question and then go forward. I think what everyone has to understand is that in Hungary, the public opinion is not the cause of any political decision, it's the consequence of political decisions. So it's like there is far the most centralized media system in Hungary. It's a disinformation machinery that Orban built up in a way that is being inspired partially from Anglo-Saxon models and the populist understanding of post-truth, but also highly inspired by Eastern models, including Vladimir Putin's Russia as well. And the Orban could shift the Hungarian public opinion to a highly anti-Ukrainian and increasingly pro-Russian direction, I would say, where his position right now seems to be normal in the public. Orban is defining the foreign policy stakes for everything. He's almost alone in the domestic political environment when it comes to talking about foreign policy. And despite the fact that, as I told, even Transcarpathian Hungarians called on Orban to help Ukraine in the integration, because it would help also to get closer for them to Hungary, as we could see in the case of Romania and others. Orban seems to ignore that. So I think domestic politically he has to face no challenge, and the media environment favors him so much that he does not have to face any domestic political challenge. So I've just read this argument recently somewhere that Orban said that behind closed doors, that he is afraid that he can lose votes in the European parliamentary election if he is not blocking Ukraine's integration. I think it's again a pretext. Orban wants to keep up his leverage, and he wants to push the decision in for the long run. Also, in line with what Milan said, I think Orban would also like to have only a short-term decision on Ukraine's support, so he can pick it up every year again and again, or even maybe every half year, so that to keep up the leverage. But yes, the media is important. Regarding this sovereignty defense, sovereignty protection package that is right now that has been passed in the parliament this week, it can have really a chilling effect on the remnants of the Hungarian civil sector, the independent think tank sector, and the free media as well, with setting up a new so-called sovereignty protection authority that in a highly arbitrary manner can go against institutions that they feel are interfering into Hungarian domestic political processes, changing the discourse. And in light of the enemies they have picked so far, my institute, Political Capital, is among them. We can have no real illusion about if they will use it against Russian or Chinese electoral interference, or more about Western European, American, and so on. And in a highly cynical manner, this law is justified by the ongoing attempts, Ursula von der Leyen's Defense of Democracy package, the ING2 committee, and so on. So the tendencies in Brussels to crack down more or to be more alarmist about foreign interference, but Orban uses this argument to push back Western support for politics, for civil society, and so on. And I think I would stop here for the moment.
Thank you. Over to you, Shane.
Thank you. I wanted to second a lot what Milan has said, because I think we can have both, an Orban that is sort of, acting on really ideological grounds, but also on a transactional basis. And I think we're seeing both phases of that taking place. And I completely agree with, I think, the parallel that Milan drew with other instances where enlargement and accession talks were stopped by individual member states should not be forgotten, including by large member states like France. And I think, Orban therefore sees himself entirely in his own right to do exactly what others have done in the past, despite the geopolitical urgency. So I think it's very useful to put these actions in that context. What I would stress, however, which we haven't discussed very much today, is the role that Poland can play now. And in particular, I think that helps answer András's question about Article 7. I think, the ability of Orbán to continue to play that game and to be so difficult in Europe really depends on Poland's attitude going forward. If Donald Tusk decides to break this alliance that has been ongoing for the last few years between Poland and Hungary, I think it terribly isolates Orban and allows potentially a new Article 7 procedure to carry the day. And so I think that is a big question that hasn't been asked yet, and on which I think Poland will have to take very, very important strategic decisions. I would also be careful on the fine prints of the MFF agreement that comes now. I think it's very, it's a midterm review of the multi-annual financial framework. To me, what is very important is how hopeful this puts the EU to agree to a larger EU budget reform in 2027. And my fear is that this agreement that we have on the MFF is a very minimal agreement, including on the Ukrainian facility. It might be, as was said by Peter, something that is actually more limited than what Ukraine needs, so that it still gives leverage to Hungary every few months or every year to block. So I would be very mindful of what the fine prints of this agreement will be, and which will probably only be known to us on Friday. And here I would watch for two things, how much the EU has really committed to Ukraine, especially in a context where the US doesn't seem able to, and how much the EU is doing beyond the Ukraine facility, because my understanding is that the MFF review was really, limited to the bare minimum other than the Ukraine facility, and that's not very encouraging for a broader EU budget reform going forward. And that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Shaheen. I want to bring in Ukraine again as well, and then give both Silke and Peter a chance for collecting all questions asked and final comments. I want to go back to Ukraine because we've been hearing the calls quite clearly, and the Ukrainian finance minister said recently in November that without Western support, there would be an estimated $29 billion budget hole. We know that things aren't really progressing in the US either. There's currently a blockage of an aid package worth some $60 billion being stalled in Congress and facing pushback from Republicans. So there's a question about what to do about Ukraine funding, and there are some voices that are saying, well, there could be bilateral non-EU solutions to that. So I just want to ask our speakers to circle back to the looming deadlock over Ukraine funding as well. And please feel free to take up Shaheen's points as well as other questions that I may have missed in the chat. I just see one question coming in from Johannes Ahlefeld. Any ideas on the role of V4 in the future as influence on EU decision making? Yes, please feel free to take this one up as well. Perhaps we could start with Silke and then Peter.
Yeah, on MFF, I'd be very pessimistic. I mean, I don't see much of an appetite for future reform. The Frugals have been saying in the past few weeks, the Commission, it should look at where to get the funds now, just scraping money together. But I don't see much of an appetite for reform. I mean, some people talk about own resources. And I think it's just not on the mind of the coalition in Berlin. I mean, they're too busy trying to scrape together money for themselves. And historically, we've seen any kind of MFF reform is always a sore subject. So it's going to lead to a lot of acrimonious debates. So I think leaders are going to avoid it if they can. And in the past few weeks, I mean, what I've seen is really, I mean, they're trying really to minimize this. And And Berlin has been very vocal about wanting to support Ukraine, but that's about it. I mean, even before we had the ruling from the Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe. So I think, you know, I actually wouldn't expect anything in terms of that. I mean, interesting enough, I mean, Scholz has been vocal about wanting to support Ukraine, but I feel, especially in the south of Europe, the support is waning. There is a certain kind of fatigue, and I mean, my personal guess would be after the U.S. election, there's going to be mounting pressure on Zelensky to negotiate, and then we'll see eventually a new fight about reconstruction of Ukraine, because it will have to be something that will have to be dealt with in Europe. I don't see the US coming in, and then we'll get the question about loans and grants, and obviously loans and the EIB, that sort of a solution that's been evoked by many. Loans are not a very attractive solution because then Ukraine will pile up debt. And from what I hear from diplomats, it's something they're very worried about, the cost of reconstruction. But again, I think it'll be, you know, everyone will try to postpone it. If you ask people about reconstruction now, I've tried to do so. But I just don't get an answer because no one has one.
Thank you, Silke. Over to you, Peter.
Yes, thank you. Now, very telegraphic note. There are many good questions regarding Visegrad that was raised by Johannes in the chat. I think that V4 cooperation, which has always had its ups and downs, is practically over for the moment. Poland and Hungary takes very different lines, and Donald Tusk, he has a personal conflict as well with Orban. So I'm even doubtful how much leverage Poland has on Hungary right now under this new leadership, given these political antagonisms. And I think we should just forget about V4. It is more Hungary is teaming up a bit more, or Orban tries to team up a bit more with Fico right now. I would not take it for granted that Fico will sideline Orban, not even in the votes in the council now or in the positions as we see, but also on the longer run. So I think it's up to a question, of course, if there will be a leadership change in Czech Republic as well, and Babiš comes back, then Orban can have a bit more leverage in the region. But generally, I think the point is exactly what Shahin has raised before, that Orban is more isolated than ever before, and that's the position from which he right now it does his quite risky game, trying to change EU decisions in a period where he, even if he was reluctantly supportive towards most of the sanctions round so far, he could have not diverted the Euro-Atlantic response regarding Ukraine so far. Right now he can. So I think this moment is really historic in that sense. And I do think that the real question is exactly what is raised in the chat by Peter, that does Orban blackmail works. Unfortunately, right now, it seems that it is going to work. And of course, let's wait and see what happens in the next 2 days. But if it does, then it will just give a feedback to Orban that this is the way to go. And it will be paralyzing and also destructive for European Council decisions in the future. And it should be up to another discussion, I think. The question about leverages, but I think EU leaders has to be way more creative in the future and to a certain extent more consistent as well in their policies on how to approach Orban. Yes, Orban still have a bit of transactional logic, but for ideological reasons, I think he will be even more combatant towards Ukraine, towards EU decision-making, towards transatlantic relations. So I think that this is the This is the bottom line. This is the picture that we have to adapt to, and Orban won't change his policies. So even if he receives right now what he would like to, he will not be more ready to compromise in the future. Just the very opposite, I think.
It seems that it will be quite the political thriller to watch over the next 2 days. Thank you so much for your insights, Silke, Peter, and Daniela, as well as Shaheen and all others in the audience. I'd like to second what my colleague Migle is posting in the chat about becoming member of DGAP if you want to. And above all, I would like to say Merry Christmas and Happy New Year soon. This morning briefing series will resume in the new year, hopefully with better news. But unfortunately, I think there will be many geopolitical challenges left to be discussed next year. So we will be back here on the 11th of January. Until then, all the best, and thank you so much for joining.